I wanted to start with just looking at some general issues in terms of literacy teaching. And you'll see, with apologies to Prince, the artist formerly known as Language Across the Curriculum, now called Literacy Across Learning. And just basically reminding you that these are the same four attainment targets there were in 5 to 14, in that there is, within the language experiences and outcomes, you've got talking, listening, reading and writing. The only difference with the new curriculum for excellence one is that instead of having listening and talking as two separate entities, they've put them together, because essentially you really can't have one without the other. That's a direct quote from the Literacy Across Learning document, and it's about the fact that it's essential for progress in all areas of the curriculum, language. So because of this, every teacher has a particular responsibility. And this whole idea that you need to think about literacy in perhaps a wider dimension, sometimes people kind of get hung up on its reading and writing, but the talking and listening is just as important for it. And so this idea of you need to find opportunities to encourage young children and young people to explain their thinking, debate their ideas, read and write at a level that will help them develop their language skills further. I draw your attention to that first sentence: competence and confidence in literacy, including competence in grammar, spelling and the spoken word. This idea that anybody who's marking children's work has to apply the same rules. So for some staff, that makes them feel really uncomfortable because their confidence in grammatical constructs or spelling might be a problem. So it's something to remind students that no matter what their subject discipline, that's something that they're supposed to be able to do. This comes in also from the Building the Curriculum documents. It's not a new initiative, but this idea that literacy unlocks the wider curriculum. And the thing that you need to remember, no matter what your subject discipline is, that in Language Across Learning, learners need to read, write, listen and talk in all the disciplines, and sometimes that requires a specialist vocabulary. Now, I wanted to put this up to show you, if this is an argument for what we want our young people to be for the 21st century child: a global citizen, creative, active, driven, knowledge-hungry, independent, an investigator, a planner, a leader, an optimist. That's a really positive, aspirational view. But to give them the literacy skills to actually help them to do that and to be that, you need to think a little bit outside the box. So let's take a look at what the definition of literacy is. A set of skills that allows the individual to engage fully in society and learning through the different forms of language, the range of texts which society values and finds useful. I want to unpack that just a teeny little bit, because there's a slightly worrying thing for me in that it says through the different forms of language and the range of texts which society values and finds useful. I think that's an incredibly loaded term. So if society does not value comics or graphic novels, does that mean that we don't look at them? When in fact, of course, we absolutely should look at them. When we're not talking just about the texts of a book anymore, we're talking about all kinds of different texts, especially in this digital society. I also want you to think not just about a very narrow definition of literacy to do with reading and writing. I want you to think, if you think of that description of the 21st century child, think about other forms of literacy, and you could equally have visual literacy, scientific literacy, mathematical literacy, critical literacy. There's tons more. So you can add all of those, because each of those has its vocabulary, each of those has its grammar, each of those has its structures. And if you're going to try and teach kids to think about that, then that's what we need to be doing. Now, please God this will work, because I want to show you a little clip. example of one of the kinds of literacies that we often don't look at. But if you think about it, there's a grammar, there's a structure, there's a context for it. So when you're thinking about literacy, do also remember that there are other different kinds of literacy. I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that I mentioned very briefly earlier on that we need to think about what we mean when we talk about a text. And I give the students as an exercise, I ask them to take a minute to write down as many forms of texts as they can. The most they've ever come up with is 15. There are actually 30 different forms of text in the Language Across Learning document. And so here we have some of them. Okay. If you look at that list, look at the list that's there now. That wouldn't have been that list 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. Certainly social networking sites wouldn't necessarily have been on it. Blogging might not have been on it. We had an interesting debate with one of the classes about whether or not text messaging would have been on it 10 years ago. I think it might actually have been, but I'm not entirely sure. But what I want to, again to remind you is that we're no longer talking about texts in the old form when it's between the pages of a book, and therefore that means that people read in different ways. For example, if you're reading an internet site, you're not necessarily reading it in a linear fashion. You're actually maybe following hyperlinks and coming back. So again, you need to teach the skills of actually getting back to the original ideas and so on. But the interesting thing about that is, of course, that you can play around with the presentation, you can increase the size of the font, increase the size of the print, you can go back and forwards and so on. And I've just put up some examples, as you can see. So we have a poem, we have a wee bit from Arnie and his kindergarten cop. The top one, of course, is a concept map, sometimes called a mind map, and of course some examples of newspapers. So any of those kinds of reading could be from your area of the curriculum. So what do we need to think of in terms of development in literacy? 4 particular areas within a school that will look at literacy teaching. There will be certain, in secondary schools in particular, there will be certain departments where the focus is on literacy development. For example, the English department, but perhaps history, but remember in a primary school, that would be every teacher's responsibility. But there are subject-specific literacy demands within individual areas in the curriculum. For example, if you think about looking at a periodic table, chemistry or something like that, they would have to learn how to read the symbols and things like so on and so forth. And then there are cross-curricular issues of literacy. So are we sure, for example, that colleagues across a school are using the same advice to students, to pupils? Are they all marking to the same standard? Are they all giving the same advice about structures of writing, for example? And then there's the whole thing about the school concentrating and giving a positive ethos towards literacy. There needs to be a consistent approach, and that means, for example, that good practice tells us there should be a common correction code for work, so that every teacher is marking a child's work in the same way. I don't know if I've mentioned, I think I may have mentioned this before in a presentation I did earlier, that one of the things we need to think about is how you mark errors in children's work, pupils' work. For example, you know what it feels like if you get something back and it's covered in red ink? It really is a hugely negative experience. The advice we always used to give was, in a piece of writing, yes, you need to look at what we call the secretarial errors, the punctuation, the spelling and things like that, but try and only concentrate on 2 surface errors at any one time. So that the way that I used to do it was, if the first error I came across was a comma splice, in other words, when they used a comma when they should have used a full stop, I would mark every example of that in the work. And the next one I might come across might be a spelling confusion of there, and there, you know, for the sake of argument. I would mark every example of that. So in the work there will still be some errors left, but that's fine, because the thinking behind that is if you learn the rules for those 2 surface errors and you correct that, then the next time, for the next piece of work, you look at 2 other surface errors. So there's this idea of not absolutely swamping them with the marking. Correction codes should be displayed in classrooms and should be consistently used throughout the school. You will also need to think about differentiated support for children in literacy, and some need more support in reading than writing, some need more support in writing than reading, so you need to think about how you're going to handle that. And please, as I said, please don't underestimate the importance of listening and talking to support reading and writing. What I've done there is just taken all the experiences and outcomes from the literacy across learning and put them in a table. And the reason I've done that is because I want to show you that across the attainment targets of reading, writing, listening and talking, there are some similarities and some differences. There is an enjoyment and choice strand across the whole of all of the reading, writing, listening and talking. And the tools section is the same across all of the attainment targets. Do have a look at the tools sections, especially because that's where all the kind of nitty-gritty is broken down. That's where you'll figure out when they have to be able to do what in writing or when they have to be able to do what in reading. So that's the tools section, will give you all of that information. Notice in the next strand a slight difference. For reading and for listening and talking, the focus is finding and using information, but for writing it's organising and using information. And there is understanding, analysing and evaluating in reading and listening and talking, but not for writing. And in creating text for writing and listening and talking, but not for reading. So again, those headings should all be relevant to specific subject areas, and so you will be looking at literacy targets in each of those areas. I wanted just to kind of look at some opportunities that technology can give us to look at literacy. So, you know, we can use all of the kind of email, or we can use text messaging, internet, all of these things to do these particular tasks. We can acquire information, we can participate in a discussion. You can't get the kids to do group class discussion, but they'll all be on Facebook till they're, you know, blue in the face. They'll be talking to each other on Facebook, they'll be text messaging all the time. That's partly discussion, it's written discussion, if you think about it. So again, you have to remember to think about what they're actually using and show them how that literacy impacts on that. To have a look at the talking one just at a minute, just to look at to question, hypothesize, speculate, evaluate and think critically. A lot of these terms actually come from Michael Halliday's work in terms of language skills and structures. And if you do want to have a look at that, that's very good to look at in terms of the kinds of language, the kinds of functions of language that we use in our society. So what does it mean in practice? Any subject requires students to read and write, and therefore that requires that there's an expectation that they're literate. Each subject has its own vocabulary, and so you need to give them the key words, you need to give them the vocabulary to do this. I think that's a very underestimated point, that a necessary condition for learning literacy in any subject is that they read and write in that subject. Now, I know that we ask sometimes that our students be allowed to, for example, follow a child through a day's learning, you know, in the secondary school. Another thing that's useful in the primary school is to audit how much are the children asked to read in a day, how much are the children asked to write in a day, and how much support do they get. Because I think it is something that we do forget. Sometimes we assume there's a great deal of reading and writing going on, but when you actually look at it, there's not. So again, you need the practice in order to be able to develop literacy skills. We need to give them context in which to practice the skills. We need to give them the discourse of that curriculum area, and we should think about the role of literacy in motivating learning. Remember that you learn the language itself, then you learn in the language, and then you think about the language functions. What does it do? How can I persuade somebody? How can I entertain someone? How can I do all of these things? I chose reading for information as a kind of target topic to have a look at, just to see, because I know that most of you will ask children to read for information in your subject areas. So one of the things that we need to think about is how we as teachers do that, and that is, first of all, we need to show them how to do it, give them the strategy to do it, model the strategy, and then that standard teaching practice thing, first ask them to do it. You model it, then you ask them to do it collaboratively. Then you give them a guided attempt at it. So in other words, you're gradually withdrawing teacher support all the way through all the time until eventually get to the independent use of the strategy. So again, those are all things that's a standard teaching strategy in lots of subjects, so you can use that in terms of helping reading. I also wanted to draw your attention to this as some very useful strategies to help for non-fiction reading. Now, please tell me if you know what all of these are, or if you want me to very quickly go through what each of the strategies.
Think alouds.
Think alouds. Think alouds is when a teacher actually models what they're thinking as they're reading something. So then maybe you take a passage and you read it and you get to a point and think, well, that's a new word, I don't know what that word is, I need to look that one up, or I wonder, can I work it out from the way it's used in this. So you're actually verbalising what you're doing in your head to give that as a good model for children to try. Can I just make a point about, see this number 7, the group discussion procedures? Quite often close, that's when you've got a gap, you know, you're asking the child to fill in the missing word. Sometimes you see that used as what I call busy work, you know, they're finished early, fill in the gaps in the passage. That's not how it's meant to be used. It's meant to be a discussion topic. So you get a wee group of kids and they've got a passage with some blanks in it, and they are working out which word goes in. Now you can offer them support, you can give them a word bank if you need to, or you can ask them to think about it. It's a really good one if you're teaching a particular skill in the sciences. Maybe what you've got missing is what maybe it's a test tube is missing, or this is a catalyst, or whatever you do, you actually decide what it is that you want to use for your closed procedure. Reciprocal teaching, everybody aware of that is? Basically getting the kids to teach one another. And it's a hugely successful way of doing it, because then it shows them, one, what they know, and two, forces them to actually articulate it so that they can actually, it helps with understanding as well. In terms of writing, a couple of things that you need to do. You really need to tell them what they need to do, clear success criteria. What does this piece of writing need to do in order to be successful? Who are you writing it for, and why are you doing it? That known consequences, what happens with this piece of writing? Is it just going to stay in my jotter? Who's going to read it? Is it going to be published elsewhere? If I get it wrong, what's going to happen? So you need to tell them what's going to happen. Give them access to different kinds of models of writing and demonstrations, and give them guidance during writing. If the piece of writing is to test a bit of subject knowledge, then yes, you want them to follow good literacy practices, but that should not impede them doing the task. The first priority is the subject knowledge information. So you can help them, give them guides to writing. They do need time, and you need to give them feedback. All fairly standard things you need to do. I've put up a list of, I think, quite interesting and useful, easy to read and easy to access material. I think, see the second one, Colin Harrison, the 2003 one, Understanding Reading Development, that's one of the most easy to read and successful books. So if you're interested in that area, that's a really good one to have a look at. Obviously, I've looked at both primary and secondary, so you can see that there are also some teaching reading in the secondary school as well. And I've put up again a number of websites. The first one, that's the UK Literacy Association, and again they've got a lot of useful resources on it. You don't know if you knew that Edinburgh was the very first European city of literature, and that's actually part of their City of Literature website. They've got a lot of good Scottish links for Scottish literacy support there. Google has a literacy site as well, worth knowing about. And that last one is a piece of work that was commissioned by Colin Harrison, the guy that I spoke about earlier on, for Scottish Government. And it looks at the teaching of reading. And again, it's freely available as a PDF on the internet, very easy to read, and it gives you a lot of support.